these depleted uranium anti-tank rounds are part of these larger packages that the United States and the EU, in particular the EU and the UK, now outside of the EU technically, are sending to Ukraine now to get ready for the spring offensive. You heard, right? Weeks and weeks and weeks now. This is Ukraine's last chance. This is the time for Ukraine to mount its attack. Well, despite these escalations, despite the depleted uranium anti-tank rounds, despite all of the munitions and the tanks and all of this that has been promised to Ukraine, there's a lot of concern. So you've heard it from the US side. You've heard it from places like the RAND Corporation. You've heard it from the collective West saying, well, this is probably Ukraine's last chance. Now you're hearing it from Zelensky himself. Zelensky himself is admitting that this counteroffensive is just not a go right now. It's just not possible. So here you have reported today from Zelensky himself that Kiev's troops are suffering from a lack of ammunition, says the Ukrainian president. And so this is what we've been hearing. I covered it in the last program. We're now going to see through these new packages where the EU and the UK and NATO stockpiles really are, because we've all had suspicions that they're very low. And so the Duran and people like that have been calling this now, and I find the Duran's characterization of this pretty apt. They've called it the cinematic offensive, meaning that is well more PR than it is reality. It's way more PR, public relations, than it is reality. And that's because we've been speaking for months. I've done it on this channel. The Duran has done it on their channel. Scott Ritter has done it here, and he's done it elsewhere. He's been everywhere. We've all been saying that there's a problem with the amount that NATO can supply, and that Ukraine has been burning through it. They've been trying to say Russia's been burning through theirs. But the fact of the matter is that Ukraine has been burning through this. It's just pure projection. So here you have Zelensky saying in an interview released on Saturday by the Japanese newspaper Yomiuri, Zelensky said that the situation on the front line, quote, was not good, end quote, explaining that Kiev's forces lacked enough ammunition to launch an operation. On the subject of an offensive, the Zelensky regime stated that we can't start it yet without tanks, artillery, and U.S.-supplied rocket launchers, the HIMARS. We cannot send our brave soldiers to the front lines. We are waiting for ammunition to arrive from our partners, he added, claiming that Russian troops had been firing 3 times as many shells as the Ukrainian side. And yet Russia is not the one who is complaining and talking about how poorly they are doing with ammunition and weaponry. They're not talking about shortages on the Russian side. Isn't that very interesting? So in light of this, he reiterated his calls for Kiev's Western backers to send more arms and urged them to sign off on deliveries of fighter jets. Commenting on a potential dialogue with Russia, Zelensky insisted that absolutely no conditions have been formed on this, suggesting that Russian forces would have to leave the territory Ukraine claims as its own. Moscow has repeatedly said that it is open to talk with Kiev on the condition that it recognizes the reality on the ground, referring to the new status of the 4 Ukrainian regions as part of Russia. So speculations about imminent Ukrainian spring counteroffensive have been swirling in Western media for several weeks now. Last week, Politico reported that the U.S. expected Kiev to start the offensive in May, with Ukrainian troops attempting to push into Crimea either by crossing the Dnieper River, which was considered an unlikely option, or moving out from their positions in the north. Around the same time, the New York Times reported that Western officials are worried that Ukraine's costly attempts to hold on to the strategic Donbas city of Bakhmut could jeopardize the upcoming offensive, given that Kiev's Western backers would not be able to replenish its ammunition stocks anytime soon. With this in mind, one Pentagon official cited by the outlet said that the anticipated push was a last-ditch effort. On Friday, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, who serves as deputy chairman of the National Security Council, said that Moscow is well aware of Ukrainian plans to stage an offensive, noting that Russia's general staff is making its own assessments on the matter and planning a response. And you know what's so interesting about this spring offensive? It's not just that Ukraine is worried about, and Zelensky is admitting that they don't have the weapons and they're not going to probably get them anytime soon, or at least in the volume that they're going to need to sustain a spring offensive. And I think that's why Zelensky is saying this, because there probably is a lot of pressure right now on Zelensky to get a move on. May is right around the corner. That's only a little more than a month away. So Zelensky is sounding the alarm. And what's so interesting about this is that what Dmitry Medvedev says, well, we're making assessments and we're preparing. Well, of course they're preparing, everyone, because get this. Get this. So what have we heard? We've just heard over and over and over again that that Ukraine is preparing for this. Ukraine is preparing for this. They're basically giving away their plans. What kind of military strategy is this? I'm not a military strategist, but I do know that you don't just blast out to all the major Western mainstream media outlets and Kiev outlets and Ukrainian outlets and all the allied outlets of this proxy war led by the United States. You don't do that if you hope to maybe surprise the opponent, if you hope to have any kind of chance, especially in the midst of arms shortages. So this is obviously, as the Duran would call it, like a cinematic experience. It is a public relations stunt, really. And it's hard to know where the profits of the military-industrial complex, the interests of the military-industrial complex begin, and where really the military strategy ends, and vice versa. You don't really know where's the chicken, what's the egg here, because it's obvious that a lot of this is about, a lot of this is about getting Ukraine to basically be a conduit for the military-industrial complex. Just dump all the weapons, dump them all there, and that's really what it is looking at like right now. Okay, what's going on here? Let me cancel this. All right. So this is desperation, right? This is really desperation. Zelensky is already noting that this is not in good shape. And it doesn't matter, right? The depleted uranium, it matters because that can really hurt people, right? That can really hurt people. And of course, as I've had Brian Berletic on here say over and over and over again, and it's true, all of this is just to prolong the conflict. It's just to prolong this conflict. And that should be really the most troubling thing here, is that it's not really about military strategy. It's not even damn well really about winning, right? It's not even really about winning. It's about just continuing this onslaught so that the United States benefits. That's really what it is. And so the collective West benefits. That's what this is all about. Zelensky showing once again that even in the midst of raising the alarm, he's only doing it to say, we need more. Now, Zelensky's been saying this for months. We need more. We need more. Give me more. Give me more weapons. Zelensky's like a child. He's like a child without the pacifier. Give me my pacifier. No, the pacifier's not good enough. Throw out the pacifier. Give me something bigger. Give me something better, right? That's what Zelensky sounds like. That's what he's been sounding like for months as the situation on the battlefield has changed. So, this is, I think, really the crux of it, right? This is what this is all about. This is all about a failed project. The counteroffensive has already failed. And now someone might say, Danny, it hasn't failed yet. It hasn't even started legitimately. And they could make a lot of gains. You don't know. They could make gains. They have a military. They have been fighting, quite intensely. They have been doing this for a while. They have obvious motivation. They obviously like to kill Russians, right? There's obviously been a buildup over the last 8 years of anti-Russia sentiment, of so-called Ukrainian nationalism, really fascism. There's been an uptick in that. The US and NATO have coddled it, have empowered it, have, uh, you know, basically sown the seeds, watered them, and watched them grow, and then put weapons in their hands. So, with all of that, of course, there is probably a lot of motivation on the Ukraine side, at least militarily, to do this because that's the only option that Ukraine is giving them, that people like Zelensky are giving them, that NATO and the United States are giving them. They're not giving them any hope for peace or for negotiated settlement or for a ceasefire, even. That's not what they're doing. And so Zelensky's sounding the alarm, and he should be, because this is a very dangerous time for Ukraine. Ukraine is faltering, it's collapsing, its economy has been decimated, its economy has at least shrunk by 1/3 since the beginning of the special military operation in February of 2022. And that's probably an underestimation. The IMF is giving Ukraine, what is it, 15 million, $15 billion. They're giving a major infusion of cash and of loans to Ukraine to try to fortify and solidify what is basically a failed state, right? And this is against IMF rules. Supposedly, the IMF is not supposed to give its conditional loans and all the other austerity packages that it levels upon countries in technical war zones. But the IMF is making an exception for Ukraine because the IMF is a tool of the United States and the collective West. And so, even with that, though, it's not going to save Ukraine's economy. Ukraine's economy is decimated. It is completely and utterly destroyed. And Zelensky continues to take it further and further into the graveyard. So there really is no salvaging Ukraine without a complete and utter cessation of the conflict. But Ukraine is not giving that out, the Ukrainian regime. Zelensky's not giving that out. Russia has given that out. You all remember April 2022, there was a peace deal ready to go. And what did the UK, the United States, what did the collective West do? They said, absolutely not. We're not ready for that yet. And so what have you had since then? Well, you've had tens of thousands of troops alone, Ukrainian troops alone, dying in Bakhmut. 1 point on the front line has wasted away tens of thousands of Ukrainian armed forces. And that's not even to mention the over 100,000, probably an underestimate, of Ukrainian military forces that have been killed. And Russia still has 200,000 troops about, waiting to be deployed when they are needed from the partial mobilization earlier last year. So the situation doesn't look good. And Zelensky said it. The situation on the battlefield doesn't look good. We don't really have much. We can't do what you're telling us we need to do. And that's a big problem. That's a huge problem for Zelensky. That's a huge problem for Ukraine. And you would think that this is a huge problem for the collective West, but it's not. And here's the reason why. The collective West doesn't care about Ukraine. This has had ramifications for the collective West and for the US and for NATO, of course. Stockpiles are drained, economies all across Europe and the United States, basically basket cases. You look at what's happening to the banks in the United States. Maybe it's not a direct correlation, but the impact of this conflict has had huge ramifications, including the raised interest rates to try to stifle the inflation, which has been a product in part because of the massive Russian sanctions, anti-Russian sanctions the US and the EU have placed on Russia and thus on the world economy. So this has had ramifications for the collective West, but it doesn't have, remember, economic crises, military crises. These are not felt by the forces that are driving this. Who's driving this? Who's driving this conflict, everyone? It's NATO. It's the United States. It's the neocon foreign policy establishment. Who controls them? It's Wall Street. It's the military-industrial complex. And it's all of the forces in the ruling elite that see money signs and see incredible opportunities to benefit and profit from this war. Remember what Antony Blinken said during his reaction to the Nord Stream debacle. What did he say? He said the destruction of Nord Stream was a great opportunity for U.S. LNG suppliers to wean Europe off of Russia's energy. basically wean it off of dependence on Russian energy. That's what he said, to paraphrase. And so that's what this war is all about. It's about subjugating Europe under the diktats of US capital. It's about waging a war on Russia, preparing for that long war on Russia that the United States has been foaming at the mouth to wage for over a decade now. And this is also about getting rich. This is about getting rich for these military contractors, for Raytheon, for Boeing, for Lockheed Martin. It's about getting rich. Northrop Grumman. It's also about getting rich for the banks and the stocks of all these major corporations I just named in the weapons industry and the oil industry. It's about getting rich for them because they want to see a huge return on their investments. And so that's what Ukraine has always been about. And Zelensky has always just been a puppet for that. And that's why Zelensky relies on fascists and neo NAZIs and just ordinary NAZIs and all sorts of incredibly abhorrent forces, of which he is of one, right? Let's not forget, while Zelensky might have campaigned one way by collaborating with these forces, by taking money from major billionaires and collecting his own stash and having one of the most corrupt governments in the world, he, in fact, is one of these forces. He has majorly profited from this. He is a puppet. He's majorly profited from this. So despite the fact that he's sounding the alarm, right, we hear him saying, I can't wage this counteroffensive. All that is code for send me more. I'm in my high chair, daddy, right? This is the United States. This is NATO. They're all his collective daddy. If we look at the collective West as that for Zelensky, and he's saying, give me more. I need more. I'm shaking my rattle. Won't you reward me? That's what Zelensky is, right? And unfortunately, there's no Department of Children and Family Services to call for him when he, snorts what he snorts and does all that stuff. But the real important thing here is that no matter what conditions Zelensky's in mentally or what he's trying to do, in this conflict, he is just a puppet. And he's a puppet that's been maybe given a little too much power, a little too much influence because of how much the US and its collective West vassals have leaned on this Ukraine conflict for so much more than just the war's purposes. That's why I like this expression, cinematic counteroffensive, this cinematic offensive, because it really does touch on how public relations matters so much to the empire at this point. I mean, it matters so much to this failing collective West, US-led empire that everything about Ukraine is not simply about winning a war. Of course, there are a lot of strategists and neocons and their economic handlers who are like, yeah, we love this war. We want war with Russia. Yeah, that's true. But there's a lot of forces as well that see this as an opportunity to win the information war and to win the war of hearts and minds. And they say, well, we can demonize Russia. We can get Russia to look really bad in Ukraine. We can look like the arbiters of democracy again. We can be the champions of that again. And that means when we do things like wage catastrophic war, potentially World War III, we won't have to be held accountable because most people in the collective West will be sleeping about it. They'll be sleeping over it. They won't be paying attention to all of these horrible things that we're doing. They'll just be paying attention to what we're saying. And that's one of the big crises we face in the collective West around something like this counteroffensive. We have a lot of people who follow the news, who follow Ukraine, who read the Western mainstream media, and they're only following what they are saying. They're not looking at the realities on the ground or trying to find alternatives to the narrative that keeps them from understanding what's happening really on the ground, not just in Ukraine, but globally, because there are seismic shifts happening globally. The tectonic plates of the world order are moving. And so this counteroffensive, the spring counteroffensive, was doomed to fail from the beginning. I've been saying this, not because Ukrainians can't get more weapons and start killing more Russians. That's not really where the failure will be, because they will do that. Who knows how long that will last? This is a different situation in that the last time Ukraine waged an offensive, what was that, the summer of 2022? The last time they did it and they made those territorial gains, they blew everything away. They blew everything that they had, and NATO and the United States couldn't really replenish Ukraine. And that's why there's been this kind of stagnant situation on the front lines for Ukraine, is because they just don't have enough to really do anything else but to just hold the line and throw their bodies into the ringer and get slaughtered. I mean, that's kind of what's been happening. So it's not that Ukrainian armed forces, its military, won't score potential gains. They might. They very well might. But I think the bigger issue here is that it won't be enough. And not only will it not be enough, but you already have Zelensky saying they don't have enough to even launch it. If you don't even have enough to launch it, and you're not confident in that, you're only a month out. How many times have you seen in the Western mainstream media, from the New York Times, BBC, saying, "Oh, this is going to take several months. This will take some time. It'll take some time for those Challenger 2s to get there, for those Leopards to get there, for those HIMARS to get there, for you to be trained in these. That takes some time." And time isn't really what Ukraine has right now. Ukraine doesn't really have that much time to be wasting on, well, when are we going to get these weapons? Because they've just blurted it out. We're going on a counteroffensive and it's going to happen in May sometime, right? I mean, this is just, it's really clownish in some respects, but I think what it really does reflect, it reflects a certain level of desperation. That's what we're seeing. And they don't want to admit it. Zelensky doesn't really want to admit desperation. He'll admit that he doesn't have what he needs, but he doesn't want to admit that he's desperate to save his own legitimacy and his own skin with this counteroffensive. The United States and NATO don't want to admit that this counteroffensive is really about saving their own skin. They've invested a lot of skin in this game. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of billions, more than 100 billion just for the United States alone. In the EU, that's tens of billions. And then we can go on and on and on in terms of the other kinds of investments made politically, economically. I mean, Ukraine, I talked about its economy earlier. What is Ukraine's economy but basically a neo-colony? The United States and the EU and the IMF, and they're just holding it up. They're holding it up with puppet strings. They're doing their best to hold an economy together that really doesn't even exist anymore. Ukraine doesn't have an independent economy. It doesn't have an industry. It doesn't have anything. It's been decimated and destroyed by this conflict, and that is all of NATO's doing. That's all of the collective West doing. So Ukraine doesn't have the time. Zelensky is basically begging, right? He's basically calling upon his collective West masters to give him the tools that he needs to fight for his masters. And he won't be doing the fighting, of course. He'll be on the sidelines in his green screens and making media appearances and, accumulating cash, while the Ukrainians die in the tens of thousands ongoing in places like Bakhmut, which, aren't going so well in this counteroffensive. Where's it going to happen? Because Bakhmut is surrounded. Are they going to push through that encirclement, that cauldron? Supposedly there are other cauldrons forming in other parts of that front line. So what are they going to do? And what are they going to do without the time? Well, you have the United States, the collective West, and Ukraine all basically saying, we're going to do this. And Russia saying, okay, you're going to do this and we're going to prepare for it. It really is a cinematic experience. It is a public relations psyop. It really is all about trying to convince the public, especially the public in the collective West and in the NATO countries, the EU, the UK, etc. It's to convince all the public that this is worth doing forever. This is another forever war. The United States and NATO have no plans on doing anything but staying in it to essentially stay in it. And that's because there's a lot of entrenched interests here, and not even the Rand Corporation can really make any headway. So this is trouble for Ukraine. The counteroffensive is already failing, and Zelensky's sounding the alarm, but really what he's doing is he's shaking his rattles. He's huffing and puffing. He's throwing a temper tantrum and saying, bail me out, collective West, bail me out, NATO, bail me out, United States. And there's nothing left to bail out. There's nothing left to give. There's just nothing left to give. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few weeks as this counteroffensive already foreshadowed and essentially uh, told, outed to Russia. It'll be interesting to see if really it happens at all. And if it happens, how effective it will be given the changing character of the situation on the ground.